Rescue work continues in Haiti after Saturday's earthquake. The death toll reached over 1,400 while international humanitarian aid continues to arrive. President Maduro described as successful the dialogue process initiated in Mexico. He condemned the strengthening of the coercive measures undertaken by the U.S. and its allies. The United Nations urged respect for the rights of all Afghans. It also called on all parties to the conflict in Afghanistan to act with the utmost restraint. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada, and now we begin with the news. In Haiti, the death toll rises to 1,419 after the 7.2 magnitude earthquake that shook the country last Saturday. Haitian civil protection teams and rescuers from the Pan American Health Organization have provided the preliminary information of at least 2,500 people who are injured and thousands are listed as disappeared. According to Haitian Red Cross estimates, the earthquake caused severe damage to infrastructure, including hospitals such as those in the towns of Jeremy and Les Cayes, in the southwestern part of the country, the most devastated area. At the same time, the search for survivors of Haiti's devastating earthquake continued on Monday as hospitals were overwhelmed with injured people. Hundreds waited on the steps of Les Cayes general hospitals, and many patients were being treated on mattresses on the ground outside, as the hospital ran low on pain pills and other drugs. At least 6,000 people were injured and seeking treatment before tropical depression Grace makes landfall on the island, possibly bringing heavy rain and flooding and increasing the risk of landslides. At
the moment, the department was experiencing a tragedy. Many injured people, a lot of destruction, and the first place you go when you have a health problem is the General Hospital of Les Cayes. When this tragedy happened, of course, the flow of patients increased. Many people arrived, and we evacuated only the most serious patients.
President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said Mexico will continue to support Haiti following a powerful earthquake, as 2 Mexican military aircraft carrying 15.4 tons of food, medicine, and water landed in the country.
President of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse, has just been assassinated, and there is a very unstable situation, and this earthquake is another misfortune that has befallen the impoverished population. We decided to support them, and we will continue to do so. Nothing human is alien to us, and forget about borders. We need to apply the criterion, the principle of universal brotherhood.
And now we move on to other topics. In a special interview for TeleSUR, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, explained the situation of the country after La Soufriere volcano's eruption.
The volcano, there are 2 stages to it, the aftermath. One, the actual humanitarian effort. We still have a large number of persons not yet back in the Northeast. Everyone is back on the Northwest, and significant numbers are back in the Northeast. But there are areas in which water and electricity services have not yet been fully restored. And you have a lot of ash which we are cleaning, and the river valleys, we have to be cleaning them. A lot of stones which came down, and there are a lot of people who are still outside of the red zone on the Northeast, who are in shelters or in private homes outside of that area. We have about 1,500 persons still in shelters. We have 40-odd shelters still in operation, and we have to take care of those persons. And then, of course, we have to provide food and other supports for persons who have been taken in by friends or relatives, or persons who have rented rooms or apartments. And we have to help feeding them, as we have to help to feed and provide other supports, including psychosocial support for those who have gone back into the orange zone and in the lower regions of the red zone.
In view of the country's experiences and the effects that today we see in the world as a result of climate change, the Prime Minister stated,
lives and livelihoods. It's affecting the forests, it's affecting the warming of the seas, and therefore affecting fishing adversely, affecting the farmers. You have a lot of river defense problems. You have a lot of problems at the seashore with waves which are eroding the seacoast. All of these things taking place amidst the challenges of COVID and amidst the challenges of the volcanic eruptions and the challenges posed by imperialism and monopoly capitalism in our part of the world. And so when you look at us, it's really, we are very vulnerable, and it's amazing that we have been able to hold things together and move forward.
Regarding the integration of the Caribbean countries, Latin America and the OAS, Prime Minister Gonçalves gives his remarks on the need to work together and with respect.
To ensure that the OAS doesn't become an arm of modern imperialism, but we ourselves need our CELAC, our Community of States of Latin America and the Caribbean, where we can have a deeper form of integration, something more intimate and attuned to our own interests, as for instance, the Association of Caribbean States, as for instance, the ALBA, as for instance, the Caribbean Community, or the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. All these are regional integration mechanisms which have points of contact and relevance with one another, within our own interests. Still, the United States, 350 million people, they're our giant neighbor, a lot of resources, our people are linked with them through migration and trade, and tourism and everything else. And the United States is a great land of culture and science. So we can't ignore it. And we have to work with it, but we have to work with it in terms which are beneficial to the United States and to ourselves, and not to have a condition of imperial domination. I am now in my 5th consecutive term as Prime Minister. Our party has been in office since March 2001. We have won every single election since then, fair and square. So that the opposition, a right-wing group, conservative in its instincts, Trumpist in its methodology, that they are seeking to undo what they couldn't accomplish in a free and fair election. So that since 2015, in fact, we have been having these periodic protests. And since November last year, when we had my 5th term starting, because we don't have term limits for prime ministers, that they have been holding these protests, very small numbers. This has been, I believe, the largest of the lot, about 200 persons. Usually it's 50, 75, 100 plus. And we go on with our business normally. We are an open, free and democratic society. But you can't go about break the law and be violent, and you certainly can't stop.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back. President of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro Moros, described as successful the dialogue process initiated in Mexico, while condemning the strengthening of the coercive measures undertaken by the United States and its allies. During an international press conference, the head of state highlighted the approval of 3 proposals, among which are the recognition of the legitimacy of the Venezuelan authorities, the abandonment of violence and destabilizing actions, and the lifting of all sanctions. During his answers to the international media, President Maduro denounced the economic blockade against Venezuela imposed by the United States, considering it as a silent attack that hinders the acquisition of food and medicines. He also indicated that, in spite of the sanctions, he was willing to establish dialogues with the White House and to put an end to hostilities. And the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, chaired a meeting with government authorities to evaluate warranties in the supply of oxygen in the face of the increasing number of COVID-19 cases. The president pointed out that the country is making efforts to ensure that the little oxygen supply it has reached the health institutions more efficiently. The head of state referred to the complex moment the nation is going through with the spread of the coronavirus Delta strain, the difficult economic situation as a result of the siege and blockade by the United States, as well as the campaign waged against him. Díaz-Canel reiterated to local authorities the need to make savings whenever possible and to make a more efficient use of oxygen in the health institutions. Thousands of citizens in Thailand marched to the Prime Minister General Prayut Chan-o-cha's residence and there clashed with riot police. The authorities used tear gas, rubber bullets, and a water cannon to disperse the crowd. The protesters demanded the premier's resignation and requested general access to mRNA vaccines, since the country suffers its worst outbreak with over 20,000 daily cases of coronavirus in the past weeks. Some protesters threw rocks and brought down a police booth, while others expressed their need for solutions to the sanitary crisis that hit the country in the non-violent ways. Also, people in cars and on bikes took over districts with convoys and coordinated mobilized rallies, also demanding Chan-o-cha's resignation due to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. The police's repressive tactics were met with firecrackers and projectiles from civilians in the most recent confrontations. At least 70 people died in the floods that affected 3 provinces in the north of Turkey last week. 60 citizens have died in Kastamonu, 6 in Sinop, and 1 in Bartın. 8 people were still being treated in hospitals, authorities said. Turkish Minister of the Interior, Süleyman Soylu, declared to have received over 70 missing persons claims. Meanwhile, rescue teams still sweep the affected areas. Kastamonu is the place's most heavily damaged point due to the largest amount of human losses. Over 2,500 people have been evacuated, while emergency brigades assist citizens who are without water and electricity since last Wednesday. South Korea began military drills with the United States in disregard of North Korea's warnings about regional security. For 9 days, the United States and South Korea will partake in annual joint military maneuvers, with Pyongyang neighbors having stated this could be the beginning of another political crisis if there is any provocation near the border. The amount of soldiers will be limited to fewer numbers than in the previous exercises launched in March, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Seoul and Washington celebrate yearly military maneuvers mainly in the summer. North Korea has denounced several times that the drills are simulations of territorial invasion and threats to the country's sovereignty. Hakainde Hichilema was elected president of Zambia with nearly 60% of the votes. Sympathizers of the newly elected mandatory took to the streets to celebrate in different areas of the landlocked southern African country. Hichilema became the 7th president in Zambia's history since the nation's independence in 1968. In the final count, Hichilema won for the United Party for National Development with 2,810,000 votes, whereas former President Edgar Lungu came in second with 1,814,000 ballots in his favor out of the 7 million registered voters in the elections. Hichilema will now have to face the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, rising youth unemployment, and the new law of the price of copper, Zambia's main exports, which accounts for 70% of the minerals production in all Africa.
So it is a very emotional moment for some of us, but we are also mindful at the back of our heads that the Zambian people have reposed the authority to run the affairs and the aspirations and interests of the people of this country, and therefore we have to deal with this matter in a very sacrosanct manner. There is not supposed to be any excitement on our part because the burden is really, really heavy. We know for a fact that the economy has been damaged by the former government, and to what extent it's been damaged is something that we are yet to establish. And once that is established, then we will come to reality of how heavy the burden that we've decided to load ourselves upon is going to be. But we are equal to
4 people were shot to death during an Israeli police raid at the refugee camp in Jenin, while the Palestinian Ministry of Health said 2 people were killed by the Israeli occupation forces at dawn. 2 of them were identified by authorities as Raed Abu Saif and Saleh Omar. According to witnesses, Israeli troops also took 2 other bodies to the Jenin hospital. A spokesperson of Israeli border police was later quoted saying a pair of bodies were under the occupation forces' custody. The Palestinian news network identified the other 2 dead as Noor Jarrar and Amjad Hussainia. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. After taking Kabul, the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in an offensive that drove the U.S.-backed government of Ashraf Ghani to exile. Taliban communications officials have made clear their opposition to the statements of political factions that seek a transitional government. While many of the previous order's affiliates flee the country and seek political refuge in nearby nations, permanent members of the U.N. Security Council, plus India as interim president of the group, have discussed along with other states in the emergency meeting on Monday what will be the global community's approach on the new Afghan rule.
The highest price of the political and military entrenchment in Afghanistan is being paid for by the most vulnerable. The catastrophic trajectory of violence affects a population which finds itself in increasingly precarious conditions, with very few options, particularly for women and girls. Humanitarian personnel, doctors, interpreters, and other international service providers are also especially vulnerable at this moment.
There is no point in panicking. The main point is that a widespread bloodbath among civilians has been avoided. We urge all Afghan parties to refrain from hostilities and to foster a settlement peacefully. We believe that the main power players, or the international community rather, must help Afghanistan.
The A3+1 deplores the violence, human rights abuses, and the loss of life and the suffering endured by the civilian population who were forced to leave their areas because of the latest combat all over the country. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to the hostilities. We reiterate our principal rejection for any seizure of power by force and call for the establishment of an effective dialogue, convinced that the only viable solution to this conflict is a negotiated political settlement.
The war in Afghanistan has lasted for more than 40 years. Stopping the war and achieving peace is not only the unanimous aspiration of more than 30 million Afghan people, it is also the common expectation of the international community and the regional countries. The pressing task at the moment is to restore peace, stability, and order as soon as possible. so as to avoid unnecessary casualties and large-scale refugees to the utmost extent possible.
Meanwhile, Taliban declared end of war in Afghanistan. In the Afghan capital and most of the country downed in the hands of insurgents who patrol the streets and control the movement of people. The Taliban entered the presidential palace on Saturday after President Ashraf Ghani fled the country amid the rebels' rapid advance in the capital. The country's collapse occurred in a matter of weeks after the U.S. and NATO forces began the final phase of withdrawal in May, handing over all their military bases to the Afghans. At least 3 Afghans trying to flee the country were shot dead at the Kabul International Airport, which is manned by the U.S. troops. Al Jazeera television earlier reported that chaos gripped the airport as helicopters carrying foreign diplomatic officials and a flood of Afghans trying to flee the Taliban flew overhead. Images show hundreds of Afghans running on the runway as the U.S. Air Force plane takes off. And after leaving Afghanistan, the whereabouts of President Ashraf Ghani remain unknown. The president confirmed that he had left Afghanistan to avoid a bloodbath, but did not reveal where he was going. There was initial speculation that the head of state, accompanied by his wife and 2 advisors, Pakistan, but these rumors were denied on Monday by the governments of both countries, while other sources affirmed that Ghani will be in Oman. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.